In the gentle slopes of ancient Greece, where olive trees cast long shadows across sun-warmed stones, there emerged a way of thinking that would quietly reshape the human mind for thousands of years to come. The city of Athens, with its white marble columns and its bustling agora, became the birthplace of something rather extraordinary. Though it began quite simply, it began with questions. To understand the three great philosophers we will explore tonight, we must first understand the world they inhabited. Picture, if you will, the city of Athens in the 5th century before the Common Era. The streets were narrow, winding pathways of packed earth and stone. The air carried the scent of burning olive oil from lamps, the salt breeze from the nearby Aegean Sea, and the ever-present aroma of bread baking in clay ovens. This was a city of perhaps 40,000 citizens, though the total population, including non-citizens, women and slaves, may have reached nearly 300,000 souls. The Athenian democracy was still a relatively young experiment in human governance. Citizens, which is to say, free adult males born to Athenian parents, would gather in the assembly to debate matters of state. They would listen to speeches, weigh arguments, and cast their votes. This culture of public discourse, of verbal debate and persuasion, created a fertile ground for philosophical thinking. When people are accustomed to questioning the decisions of their leaders, they eventually begin to question the nature of leadership itself. When they debate what is just in a particular law, they eventually begin to ask what justice itself might be. Before our three philosophers appeared, there were others who had already begun this work of inquiry. In the Greek colonies of Ionia, on the western coast of what is now Turkey, a group of thinkers had started to ask questions about the fundamental nature of reality. Thales of Miletus, who lived around 624 to 546 before the Common Era, proposed that water was the fundamental substance from which all things arose. This may seem like a simple observation, perhaps even a naive one, but it represented something profound. Thales was seeking a natural explanation for the world, rather than relying solely on mythological accounts of gods and divine intervention. Anaximander, a student of Thales, suggested instead that the fundamental substance was something he called the apeiron, the boundless or the infinite. Heraclitus of Ephesus, living around 535 to 475 before the Common Era, famously declared that everything flows, that change itself is the fundamental reality. He said, "You cannot step into the same river twice, for fresh waters are ever flowing in upon you." These pre-Socratic philosophers, as they are now called, were attempting to understand the cosmos through reason and observation. In Athens itself, a different kind of thinker had emerged by the middle of the 5th century. These were the sophists, traveling teachers who offered instruction in rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking. The sophists were practical men. They taught young Athenians how to argue effectively in the assembly and the law courts. For a fee, they would train students in the techniques of argumentation, showing them how to make the weaker argument appear stronger, how to sway a crowd with carefully chosen words. The most famous of the sophists was Protagoras, who lived from approximately 490 to 420 before the Common Era. Protagoras is remembered for his statement that man is the measure of all things. What he meant by this was that truth is relative to the individual. What seems true to you is true for you, and what seems true to me is true for me. There is no objective standard beyond human perception and judgment. This was a radical claim, one that challenged traditional notions of absolute truth and morality. Another prominent sophist was Gorgias, who arrived in Athens in 427 before the Common Era as an ambassador from his home city. Gorgias was famous for his rhetorical skill, his ability to speak beautifully and persuasively on any subject. He reportedly claimed that nothing exists, that if anything did exist, it could not be known, and that if it could be known, it could not be communicated. While this may have been partly a rhetorical exercise, it reflected a deep skepticism about human knowledge. Into this intellectual atmosphere, this world of democratic debate, pre-Socratic nature philosophy, and sophistic rhetoric, there came a man who would change everything. His name was Socrates, and he was born in Athens around 470 before the Common Era. Unlike the sophists, Socrates did not travel from city to city. He did not charge fees for his teaching. He spent his days in the agora, the marketplace of Athens, engaging anyone who would speak with him in philosophical conversation. Socrates was not a handsome man by conventional standards. Ancient sources describe him as having a snub nose, bulging eyes, and a pot belly. He walked barefoot through the streets of Athens, wearing the same simple cloak in all seasons. He was married to a woman named Xanthippe, who was reportedly rather sharp-tempered, though this may have been an exaggeration or a joke made by later writers. He had 3 sons. He served as a hoplite, a heavily armed foot soldier, in several military campaigns during the Peloponnesian War, the long and devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta that lasted from 431 to 404 before the Common Era. But what made Socrates extraordinary was not his appearance or his military service. It was his method of inquiry. Socrates claimed that he knew nothing, and that this awareness of his own ignorance made him wiser than those who believed they possessed knowledge. He would approach people who were considered experts in various fields, whether politics, art, religion, or craftsmanship, and he would ask them questions. Through a process of careful questioning, he would reveal the contradictions and gaps in their understanding. This method, which came to be called the Socratic method, or elenchus, was not meant to humiliate or defeat his conversation partners. Socrates genuinely believed that truth could be discovered through dialogue, through the careful examination of our beliefs and assumptions. He compared himself to a midwife. Just as his mother had been a midwife who helped bring babies into the world, Socrates helped bring ideas into the light of day, examining them to see if they were healthy and viable, or if they needed to be discarded. The oracle at Delphi, the famous shrine where a priestess would deliver cryptic prophecies from the god Apollo, reportedly declared that no one was wiser than Socrates. When Socrates heard this, he was puzzled. He knew he possessed no special wisdom, so he set out to find someone wiser than himself to prove the oracle wrong. He spoke with politicians, poets, and craftsmen, but in each case, he found that while these people knew some things, they claimed to know far more than they actually did. They were ignorant of their own ignorance. Socrates, at least, knew what he did not know. This questioning of established beliefs and authorities did not make Socrates popular with everyone. Many Athenians found him irritating, even dangerous. He was often surrounded by young men from wealthy families who enjoyed watching him interrogate their elders. These young men would sometimes imitate his methods, questioning their fathers and teachers. To some, it seemed that Socrates was corrupting the youth, teaching them to disrespect tradition and authority. The political situation in Athens at the end of the 5th century was turbulent. Athens had lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta in 404 before the Common Era. The defeat was humiliating and devastating. Briefly, the democracy was overthrown and replaced by a brutal oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. This regime, which lasted only about a year, executed many Athenians and confiscated their property. When democracy was restored, there was widespread suspicion and resentment. People were looking for scapegoats, for those who might have contributed to Athens' downfall. In 399 before the Common Era, when Socrates was 70 years old, he was brought to trial on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. The accusers claimed that he did not believe in the gods of the city and that he had introduced new divinities. They claimed that his teachings had led young men astray. The trial was held before a jury of 501 Athenian citizens, ordinary men drawn by lot from the population. We know about this trial primarily through the writings of Plato, who was present as a young man. According to Plato's account, Socrates defended himself with characteristic honesty and directness. He did not beg for mercy or appeal to emotion. He explained his mission of philosophical inquiry, his belief that the unexamined life is not worth living. He argued that far from harming Athens, he had spent his life trying to improve the city by encouraging its citizens to care less about wealth and reputation and more about wisdom and the state of their souls. The jury voted to convict Socrates by a margin of perhaps 30 votes. Under Athenian law, after a conviction, both the accuser and the defendant could propose a penalty, and the jury would choose between them. The accusers proposed death. Socrates, rather than proposing exile or a large fine, suggested that he should be given free meals at public expense for the rest of his life, as was customarily done for Olympic victors and public benefactors. He argued that this is what he truly deserved for his service to Athens. Only after his friends urged him did he propose a modest fine. This response angered the jury. In the vote on punishment, more jurors voted for death than had voted for conviction. Socrates was sentenced to die by drinking hemlock, a poison made from a plant that causes gradual paralysis and death. Athenian law required a delay between sentencing and execution because of a religious festival. During this time, Socrates remained in prison. His friends visited him. They even arranged for a plan of escape. A man named Crito came to Socrates and explained that everything was ready. They could bribe the guards. They had a place prepared for Socrates to live in exile. It would be easy. But Socrates refused. In a conversation recorded by Plato in the dialogue called Crito, Socrates explained his reasoning. He had lived his entire life in Athens. He had benefited from its laws and its educational system. He had implicitly agreed to abide by those laws. Even though the verdict was unjust, even though he had been wrongly condemned, to escape would be to break that agreement. It would be to do harm to the laws themselves. And Socrates believed that one must never do wrong, even in response to wrong. It is better to suffer injustice than to commit it. On the appointed day, Socrates gathered with his friends. He bathed so that the women would not have to wash his body after death. He sent his wife and young children away, perhaps to spare them the sight of his final moments. As evening approached, the jailer brought the cup of hemlock. According to Plato's account, Socrates took the cup calmly, said a brief prayer, and drank it down without hesitation. He walked around until his legs began to feel heavy, then lay down. Gradually, the coldness and numbness spread through his body. His last words, according to Plato, were addressed to Crito. He said they owed a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing, and asked that the debt be paid. This cryptic statement has been interpreted in many ways. Perhaps Socrates viewed death as a healing, a release from the prison of the body, or perhaps it was simply the fulfillment of an ordinary religious obligation, a reminder that the philosophical life does not require abandoning everyday piety. Socrates left no writings. Everything we know about him comes from the accounts of others, primarily his student Plato, but also Xenophon, another follower who wrote about him, and Aristophanes, the comic playwright who satirized Socrates in his play The Clouds. These sources do not always agree, and scholars continue to debate what the historical Socrates actually believed versus what Plato attributed to him. What is certain is that Socrates established philosophy as a way of life. Before him, the pre-Socratics had asked questions about nature and the cosmos. The sophists had taught rhetorical techniques, but Socrates made philosophy personal and moral. He insisted that the most important questions were not about the stars or the elements, but about how one should live. He believed that virtue was knowledge, that if someone truly understood what was good, they would do it. He believed that the soul was more important than the body, and that caring for the soul required constant self-examination. His death became a defining moment in the history of philosophy. Here was a man who had lived according to his principles, and who had died rather than betray them. His student Plato would spend the rest of his life exploring and developing Socratic ideas, creating a philosophical system that would influence Western thought for millennia. And Plato's student Aristotle would in turn build on and modify that system, creating his own comprehensive account of reality and human knowledge. These three men, teacher, student, and student-student, form a continuous line of philosophical development, each responding to and building upon the work of his predecessor. As we prepare to explore their ideas in greater depth, it is worth remembering that they were not abstract thinkers working in isolation. They were men who lived in a particular time and place, who were shaped by the culture of ancient Athens, by its democratic politics, its religious festivals, its military struggles, its artistic achievements. They walked the same streets, looked at the same sky, wondered at the same stars, and the questions they asked about justice and truth and beauty and knowledge and the good life are questions that still echo through the centuries, as relevant now as they were then, quietly waiting for each new generation to consider them once more. Plato and the realm of eternal forms. When Socrates drank the hemlock in 399 before the Common Era, his student Plato was approximately 28 years old. The execution of his teacher was a traumatic event that would shape the entire trajectory of Plato's life and thought. In the years that followed, Plato would transform himself from a young aristocrat interested in politics into one of the most influential philosophers who has ever lived. Plato was born around 427 before the Common Era, into a prominent Athenian family. His actual name was Aristocles. Plato was apparently a nickname, possibly referring to his broad shoulders or broad forehead. The word platos in Greek means broad or wide. His family was well connected and wealthy. On his mother's side, he was related to Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver who had lived about 2 centuries earlier. His stepfather was a friend of Pericles, the statesman who had led Athens during its golden age. As a young man, Plato seemed destined for a career in politics. He had the birth, the education, and the connections. But the chaos of Athens in the late 5th and early 4th centuries, the trauma of defeat in the Peloponnesian War, the brief tyranny of the 30, and especially the execution of Socrates, convinced him that something was deeply wrong with conventional politics. He came to believe that cities would never be well governed until philosophers became kings, or kings became philosophers. This idea would become central to his most famous work, The Republic. After Socrates' death, Plato left Athens. He traveled for several years, possibly visiting Megara, Egypt, and southern Italy. In Italy, he may have encountered the Pythagoreans, followers of Pythagoras, who combined mathematics, music theory, and mystical religious ideas. The Pythagorean emphasis on mathematics and eternal truths may have influenced Plato's developing philosophy. He also visited Syracuse in Sicily, where he attempted, unsuccessfully, to educate the tyrant Dionysius the Elder in philosophy. This was the first of 3 voyages to Syracuse, all of which would end in disappointment and even danger. When Plato returned to Athens around 387 before the Common Era, he founded a school on a plot of land dedicated to the hero Academus. This became known as the Academy, and it would continue to function for more than 900 years, until it was finally closed by the Christian Emperor Justinian in 529 of the Common Era. The academy was not a school in the modern sense. It was more like a religious brotherhood or a research institute. Students and teachers lived together, engaged in philosophical discussions, and pursued investigations into mathematics, astronomy, and dialectic, the art of logical argument. Above the entrance to the academy, there was reportedly an inscription that read, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter." This reflected Plato's deep conviction that mathematics was essential preparation for philosophy. Geometry, with its eternal truths and abstract forms, was a model for the kind of knowledge Plato sought. The angles of a triangle always add up to 180 degrees. This is not something that changes with time or place. It's not a matter of opinion. It is an eternal, unchanging truth, accessible to the human mind through reason. Plato wrote extensively, unlike his teacher Socrates. His writings, remarkably, have survived almost in their entirety. He wrote in the form of dialogues, dramatic conversations in which Socrates is usually the main speaker. These dialogues are works of philosophy, but they are also works of literature, filled with vivid characters, dramatic tension, humor, and beauty. They are meant to be read and reread, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. The dialogues are traditionally divided into 3 periods: early, middle, and late. The early dialogues, written shortly after Socrates' death, are thought to represent the historical Socrates fairly accurately. These include works like the Euthyphro, which examines the nature of piety, the Apology, which is Socrates' defense at his trial, and the Crito, which discusses his reasons for accepting the death sentence. These early dialogues typically end in aporia, a state of puzzlement or being at a loss. Socrates asks what justice is or what courage is, examines various answers, shows that they are inadequate, but does not provide a definitive answer himself. In the middle dialogues, written during Plato's mature years, Socrates becomes more of a mouthpiece for Plato's own philosophical ideas. The most famous of these middle dialogues is the Republic, but others include the Phaedo, the Symposium, and the Phaedrus. It is in these dialogues that Plato develops his most distinctive and influential theory, the theory of forms. To understand the theory of forms, we must begin with a basic observation. Look around at the world. You see many beautiful things. A beautiful painting, a beautiful sunset, a beautiful horse, a beautiful person. These things are all different from each other in many ways, and yet we call them all beautiful. What do they have in common? What is it that makes each of them beautiful? One answer might be that they all participate in or resemble some ideal standard of beauty. There is, Plato suggests, a form of beauty itself, perfect, eternal, and unchanging. This form exists not in the physical world of space and time, but in a separate realm, accessible only to the mind. Individual beautiful things are beautiful only insofar as they participate in or imitate this form of beauty. They are like imperfect copies of a perfect original. This applies not only to beauty, but to every universal concept. There is a form of justice, a form of equality, a form of triangle, even forms of artificial things like beds and tables. The highest and most important form is the form of the good, which is the source of truth and reality for all the other forms. Plato describes the form of the good as being like the sun. Just as the sun makes physical objects visible and provides the light by which we see them, the form of the good makes the forms intelligible and provides the illumination by which we know them. The physical world we perceive with our senses is, according to Plato, a realm of mere appearances, constantly changing and imperfect. A beautiful flower blooms and then withers. A just action in one context might be unjust in another. Nothing in the physical world is perfectly anything, but the forms are perfect, unchanging, and eternal. True knowledge is not knowledge of the physical world, which is always shifting and unreliable. True knowledge is knowledge of the forms, apprehended by the intellect alone. Plato illustrates this theory with one of the most famous metaphors in all of philosophy, the allegory of the cave, found in Book 7 of the Republic. Picture, Plato says, a group of prisoners who have been chained since childhood in an underground cave. They are chained in such a way that they cannot turn their heads and can see only the wall in front of them. Behind them is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners is a raised walkway. People walk along this walkway carrying various objects, and the fire casts shadows of these objects onto the wall. The prisoners, having never seen anything else, believe that these shadows are reality. Now suppose one prisoner is freed and forced to stand up and turn around. The light of the fire hurts his eyes. He is confused and disoriented. If he is dragged up the steep path out of the cave into the sunlight, he would be even more pained and dazzled. At first, he could look only at shadows and reflections. Gradually, his eyes would adjust, and he could look at objects themselves. Finally, he could look at the sun itself and understand that it is the source of light and life, of the seasons and the years, and in a way the cause of everything he had seen before. If this freed prisoner returned to the cave to tell the others what he had seen, he would have difficulty seeing in the darkness. The other prisoners would think the journey had ruined his sight. If he tried to free them and lead them upward, they might even kill him. This allegory represents the philosopher's journey from ignorance to knowledge. The cave is the physical world. The shadows are the imperfect, changing things we perceive with our senses. The objects being carried are a step closer to reality. The journey out of the cave is the mind's ascent to the realm of forms. The sun is the form of the good. The philosopher who returns to the cave is like Socrates, trying to enlighten others and being killed for his trouble. This theory has profound implications for Plato's understanding of human beings. According to Plato, a human being is composed of a body and a soul. The body is part of the physical world, subject to decay and death, but the soul is immortal and was originally in the realm of forms before being imprisoned in a body. Learning, therefore, is actually a process of recollection, remembering what the soul once knew before it was born into a body. When we recognize that two things are equal, for instance, we are recollecting the form of equality that the soul knew before birth. Plato offers several arguments for the immortality of the soul in the dialogue called the Phaedo, which depicts Socrates' final hours before his execution. One argument is based on the idea of opposites. Hot comes from cold, sleeping from waking, life from death. So death should come from life, and life from death, in a continuous cycle. Another argument is based on recollection, as we have just discussed. Still another argument holds that the soul, being simple and uncompounded, cannot be broken apart or destroyed the way the body can. The soul itself, according to Plato, has three parts. The rational part seeks truth and is capable of apprehending the forms. The spirited part is the source of righteous anger and the desire for honor. The appetitive part is the source of physical desires like hunger, thirst, and sexual desire. A good person is one in whom these three parts are in harmony, with the rational part ruling over the other two. Plato compares the soul to a chariot pulled by two horses. The rational part is the charioteer, and the two horses are the spirited and appetitive parts. A skilled charioteer keeps the horses working together and moving in the right direction. This tripartite view of the soul is reflected in Plato's political philosophy. In the Republic, Plato designs an ideal city that mirrors the structure of the song. The city should have three classes: the rulers, who correspond to the rational part of the soul, the guardians or warriors, who correspond to the spirited part, and the producers, farmers, craftsmen, and merchants, who correspond to the appetitive part. Each class should do its proper work, and justice in the city consists of each part performing its appropriate function. The rulers in Plato's ideal city are philosopher kings, individuals who have been rigorously trained in mathematics, dialectic, and philosophy, who have ascended to a vision of the form of the good. Only such individuals, Plato argues, would have the knowledge necessary to rule well, and the lack of personal ambition that would prevent them from abusing power. They would rule not because they want to, but because it is their duty. Plato's Republic is a radical work in many ways. He proposes that the guardian class should have no private property and should live communally. He even suggests that they should share wives and children in common, so that no guardian has personal family attachments that might interfere with their loyalty to the city as a whole. He argues that women should receive the same education as men and should be eligible to become guardians or even philosopher rulers if they have the aptitude. These proposals shocked many of Plato's contemporaries and continue to provoke debate. Plato also discusses education extensively in the Republic. He is very concerned about what stories children hear, what music they listen to, and what examples they observe. Poetry, he argues, should be censored if it presents the gods or heroes behaving badly. The goal of education is to shape the soul, to help it turn away from the shadows of the cave and toward the light of truth. Early education should use music and gymnastics to create harmony in the soul. Later education should include mathematics and geometry, which train the mind in abstract reasoning. Finally, those who are capable should study dialectic, learning to give and critically examine arguments, ascending through hypothesis to the first principle of all, the form of the good. In his later dialogues, Plato revisits and revises some of his earlier ideas. In the Parmenides, he presents devastating criticisms of the theory of forms, suggesting that there are serious logical difficulties with the idea of separate, transcendent forms. In the Timaeus, he offers a creation story in which a divine craftsman, the demiurge, shapes the physical world by looking to the eternal forms as models. In the Sophist and the Statesman, he continues to explore the nature of knowledge, reality, and governance. In the Laws, his longest and perhaps last work, he describes a more realistic and practical political system than the ideal republic, a city governed by detailed laws rather than by philosopher kings. Plato lived to be about 80 years old. He died around 347 before the Common Era, still directing the Academy. His influence on the subsequent history of Western philosophy cannot be overstated. The 20th century philosopher Alfred North Whitehead famously remarked that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. This is an exaggeration, but it captures an important truth. Plato established the fundamental questions and vocabulary of philosophy. He distinguished between appearance and reality, between knowledge and opinion, between the sensible world and the intelligible world. He asked what justice is, what virtue is, what the good life is, and he proposed systematic answers to these questions. His literary skill ensured that his dialogues were read and reread, copied and preserved. His theory of forms influenced not only later philosophers, but also Christian theology, as early Christian thinkers like Augustine adapted Platonic ideas to articulate the nature of God and the soul. His political philosophy inspired countless utopian visions and dystopian warnings. His emphasis on mathematics influenced the development of science. His method of dialectical reasoning became the model for philosophical inquiry. But perhaps Plato's greatest contribution was showing that philosophy could be a comprehensive worldview. a systematic attempt to understand reality as a whole. Before Plato, philosophy was a collection of insights and arguments. After Plato, it aspired to be a complete account of the cosmos, the human being, knowledge, ethics, politics, and art. His student Aristotle would take up this project and develop it in new and different directions, creating the next great philosophical system, one that would rival, and in some periods, overshadow Plato's own. As we turn our attention to Aristotle, we will see both continuity and departure. Aristotle learned from Plato, but he also disagreed with him on fundamental issues. Where Plato looked to a transcendent realm of forms, Aristotle would look to the natural world itself. Where Plato emphasized mathematics and pure reason, Aristotle would emphasize observation and classification. Teacher and student, agreement and disagreement, the development of ideas through dialogue and debate. This is how philosophy proceeds, each generation building on and reacting to what came before. A long, slow conversation, stretching across the centuries, pausing now and then to consider a question, offering an answer, questioning that answer in turn, moving forward, step by careful step, toward understanding. Aristotle and the study of the natural world. Aristotle was born in 384 before the Common Era in the town of Stagira on the Chalcidice Peninsula in northern Greece. Unlike Socrates and Plato, who were Athenians through and through, Aristotle was an outsider, a provincial who came to Athens to study. This perspective, as an outsider, may have contributed to his more empirical, less idealistic approach to philosophy. Where Plato looked inward, to eternal truths accessible to pure reason, Aristotle looked outward to the natural world, accessible to observation and systematic study. Aristotle's father was Nicomachus, the personal physician to King Amyntas III of Macedon. This meant that Aristotle grew up in the royal court, surrounded by wealth, power, and learning. His father would have begun training him in medicine, which in ancient Greece meant close observation of the human body, attention to symptoms and causes, careful recording of what worked and what did not. This early exposure to empirical investigation likely influenced Aristotle's later approach to philosophy. When Nicomachus died while Aristotle was still young, a guardian named Proxenus raised him. At the age of 17 or 18, around 367 before the Common Era, Aristotle came to Athens to study at Plato's academy. He remained there for 20 years, first as a student and then as a teacher and researcher. These were formative years. Aristotle absorbed Plato's teachings, participated in the intellectual life of the academy, engaged in philosophical debates, and began to develop his own ideas. Plato reportedly called Aristotle the mind of the school and the reader, the latter nickname possibly referring to his voracious appetite for books and learning. But Aristotle was not content simply to accept Plato's doctrines. He questioned the theory of forms. If the forms are separate from the physical world, how can they explain anything about that world? How does the form of horse explain the existence of actual horses? How do individual things participate in the forms? These questions troubled Aristotle. He believed that philosophy must account for the world we actually experience, the world of change and motion and individual things. When Plato died in 347 before the Common Era, control of the academy passed to Plato's nephew Speusippus rather than to Aristotle. This may have been a disappointment, or perhaps Aristotle was already preparing to strike out on his own. In any case, he left Athens and traveled to the city of Assos in Asia Minor, where a former fellow student named Hermias ruled as a benevolent tyrant. Aristotle spent several years there, marrying Hermias's niece and adopted daughter, Pythias. He also began serious biological research, studying the marine life in the nearby lagoon, dissecting animals, observing their structures and behaviors. Around 342 before the Common Era, King Philip II of Macedon invited Aristotle to become the tutor to his 13-year-old son, Alexander. For several years, Aristotle taught the young prince who would later become known as Alexander the Great. What exactly Aristotle taught Alexander is not fully known. He probably provided instruction in ethics, politics, literature, and perhaps medicine. Alexander reportedly slept with a copy of Homer's Iliad, annotated by Aristotle, under his pillow. Later, when Alexander was conquering the known world, he would send back biological specimens to his former teacher, contributing to Aristotle's scientific research. The relationship between these two remarkable men is fascinating to contemplate. Aristotle, the philosopher who believed in moderation and finding the mean between extremes, teaching a young man who would become a world conqueror of legendary ambition and appetite. Alexander, who would extend Greek culture and language across an empire stretching from Greece to Egypt to the borders of India, educated by a man who spent his life observing, classifying, and seeking to understand the natural order of things. There is a pleasing irony in it, a reminder that education does not always produce the results we expect. After Alexander succeeded his father and began his campaigns of conquest, Aristotle returned to Athens around 335 before the Common Era. He could not become head of the academy, as he was not an Athenian citizen. Instead, he founded his own school, the Lyceum, named after the temple to Apollo Lyceus near which it was located. The Lyceum was similar in some ways to Plato's academy, but different in others. Aristotle's school emphasized observation, collection of data, and systematic investigation across a wide range of subjects. The students and teachers would walk around the grounds while discussing philosophy, which led to them being called the Peripatetics, from the Greek word peripatelin, meaning to walk around. At the Lyceum, Aristotle and his students undertook what we might now call scientific research. They collected and classified plants and animals. They studied political constitutions from around the Greek world, eventually compiling descriptions of 158 different constitutions, though only one of these, the Constitution of Athens, survives. They investigated logic, ethics, politics, physics, metaphysics, biology, psychology, aesthetics, and rhetoric. Aristotle wrote extensively, though most of what we have from him are not polished literary works like Plato's dialogues, but rather lecture notes or treatises used for teaching. These works can be dense and difficult, lacking the grace and drama of Plato's writings, but they are systematic and comprehensive in a way that Plato's works are not. Aristotle's approach to philosophy was fundamentally different from Plato's. Instead of positing a separate realm of eternal forms, Aristotle argued that the forms, the universal essences, exist within individual things themselves. The form of a horse is not in some separate heavenly realm, but is embodied in each actual horse. To understand what a horse is, you must study actual horses, observe their characteristics, note what they have in common, and abstract from that the definition of horse. This leads to Aristotle's distinction between form and matter. Every physical thing is composed of both form and matter. The matter is the physical stuff, the material substrate. The form is the structure, the organization, the essence that makes a thing what it is. A bronze statue, for instance, has bronze as its matter, and the shape of, say, a human figure as its form. The same bronze could take different forms. The same form could be realized in different materials, such as marble or wood. Aristotle also introduced the concepts of potentiality and actuality. An acorn is potentially an oak tree, It has the capacity to become an oak tree, but it is not yet actually an oak tree. Change, according to Aristotle, is the actualization of potential. The acorn actualizes its potential to become an oak tree by growing and developing. This framework allowed Aristotle to explain change and motion without having to appeal to Plato's separate realm of forms. Everything in nature, Aristotle argued, has a natural place and a natural motion toward that place. Heavy things like rocks have a natural motion downward toward the center of the earth. Light things like fire have a natural motion upward. Living things have an internal principle of change and growth. They actualize their potentials according to their nature. A seed grows into a plant, not because something external pushes it, but because it has an internal principle directing its development. Aristotle was fascinated by causation. He distinguished 4 types of causes, 4 different ways of answering the question, why something is the way it is. Material cause is the matter from which something is made. The formal cause is the form or essence. The efficient cause is the agent or process that brings something into being. The final cause is the purpose or end for which something exists. Consider a sculptor making a statue. The marble is the material cause. The shape or design is the formal cause. The sculptor's activity is the efficient cause. The purpose, perhaps to honor a god, is the final cause. For Aristotle, the final cause, the purpose or function, is particularly important for understanding living things and human artifacts. A knife, for instance, is understood by its function, cutting. Eyes are for seeing, hearts are for pumping blood. Everything in nature, Aristotle believed, acts for an end, though not necessarily consciously. Nature does nothing in vain. Every organ, every structure has a purpose. This teleological view, the idea that nature is goal-directed, would dominate biological thinking until the modern era. Aristotle made significant contributions to biology. He studied a wide variety of animals, from insects to mammals to marine creatures. He dissected them, described their parts, noted their behaviors. He classified animals into groups based on their characteristics. He distinguished between animals with blood and those without blood, roughly corresponding to our distinction between vertebrates and invertebrates. He noticed that whales and dolphins, though they live in the sea, are more similar to land animals than to fish. They breathe air, give birth to live young, and nurse them with milk. He studied embryonic development, observing the formation of chick embryos by opening eggs at different stages of incubation. His observations were remarkably accurate, given the tools available to him. He correctly described the 4 stomachs of ruminant animals. He noted the differences between male and female animals. He observed the behavior of bees, though he mistakenly thought the queen bee was a king. He studied reproduction, generation, and development. His work in biology would not be surpassed until the Renaissance, more than 1,000 years later. In his physics, Aristotle studied motion and change. He distinguished between different types of change. Change in substance, when something comes into being or ceases to be. Change in quality, like a leaf changing from green to brown. Change in quantity, like growing or shrinking. And change in place, which is motion. He analyzed the concept of time, concluding that time is the measure of change with respect to before and after. Without change, there would be no time. He considered the nature of place, arguing that a thing's place is the innermost boundary of what contains it. Aristotle also argued for the existence of an unmoved mover, a first cause that initiates all motion, but is itself unchanging. Everything that moves is moved by something else, but this cannot go on infinitely. There must be a first mover that causes motion without itself being moved. This unmoved mover, Aristotle suggests, causes motion not by pushing or pulling, but by being an object of desire or thought. Just as the beloved moves the lover without doing anything, the unmoved mover moves everything else by being the ultimate object of desire, perfect, unchanging, engaged in eternal contemplation of itself. Later philosophers, particularly Christian, Jewish, and Islamic thinkers, would identify Aristotle's unmoved mover with God, though Aristotle's concept is quite different from the personal God of these religious traditions. In the field of logic, Aristotle's contributions were foundational. He developed the theory of the syllogism, a form of deductive reasoning in which a conclusion necessarily follows from two premises. The classic example is, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Aristotle classified different types of syllogisms, determined which forms were valid and which were not, and established logic as a formal discipline. His logical works, collected under the title organon, meaning instrument or tool, were the standard texts on logic for more than 2,000 years. Aristotle's ethics, presented primarily in his Nicomachean Ethics, named perhaps after his son Nicomachus or his father, offers a systematic account of the good life for human beings. Every action, Aristotle begins, aims at some good. But what is the highest good? He argues that it is eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but perhaps better understood as flourishing or living well. Eudaimonia is not a fleeting emotion, but a complete life lived in accordance with virtue. But what is virtue? Aristotle distinguishes between intellectual virtues, excellences of the mind like wisdom and understanding, and moral virtues, excellences of character like courage, temperance, and generosity. Moral virtues are habits, dispositions we develop through practice. We become just by doing just actions, brave by doing brave actions, and moral virtues are means between extremes. Courage, for instance, is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and wastefulness. The virtuous person knows how to find the appropriate response in each situation, neither too much nor too little. Aristotle emphasizes that ethics is not a precise science. We cannot apply mathematical formulas to human behavior. The right action depends on the particular circumstances. A virtuous person has practical wisdom, phronesis, the ability to deliberate well about what conduces to the good life. This practical wisdom is developed through experience, through making choices and seeing their consequences, through learning from those who are already wise. Friendship plays a central role in Aristotle's ethics. He distinguishes three types of friendship. Friendships based on utility, where people are friends because they are useful to each other. Friendships based on pleasure, where people enjoy each other's company. And perfect friendship based on virtue, where people love each other for who they are. True friends wish each other well for the other's own sake. They delight in each other's presence. They share activities and conversation. Such friendships are rare, Aristotle notes, because they require time, familiarity, and mutual virtue. The highest form of human activity, according to Aristotle, is contemplation, the intellectual activity of studying and understanding the eternal truths of philosophy and science. This is the activity most similar to that of the unmoved mover, and it is the most divine part of human life. A life devoted to contemplation, to the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, is the happiest life. But Aristotle recognizes that such a life requires leisure, freedom from the necessity of laboring for survival. This is one reason he defends the existence of slavery, a deeply troubling aspect of his thought. He believed that some people were natural slaves, fitted by nature to provide the physical labor that allows others to engage in higher pursuits. This view reflects the prejudices of his society and reminds us that even great thinkers are shaped by their cultural context. In his Politics, Aristotle studies human communities. Humans, he famously states, are by nature political animals. We naturally live in communities. The city-state, the polis, exists not merely for the sake of survival, but for the sake of living well. Political communities should aim at the good life for their citizens. Aristotle examines different types of political systems: monarchy, rule by one; aristocracy, rule by the few best; and polity, rule by the many. Each of these can degenerate into a corrupt form: tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, respectively. He prefers a mixed constitution that combines elements of different systems, and a large middle class that moderates between the rich and the poor. Aristotle also wrote on rhetoric and poetry. In his Rhetoric, he analyzes the art of persuasion, identifying three modes of appeal: ethos, the credibility of the speaker; pathos, the emotions of the audience; and logos, logical argument. He recognizes that rhetoric is a tool that can be used for good or ill, but a tool that citizens in a democracy must understand. In his Poetics, he examines tragedy, arguing that it produces catharsis, a purging of the emotions of pity and fear. Tragedy shows the downfall of a good but not perfect person due to some error or flaw. By witnessing this, the audience experiences these emotions in a controlled way and is somehow purified or educated. Aristotle remained in Athens until 323 before the Common Era, when Alexander the Great died unexpectedly in Babylon at the age of 32. Anti-Macedonian sentiments surged in Athens. Aristotle, with his connections to Macedon, was charged with impiety, just as Socrates had been. Rather than face trial, Aristotle fled Athens, reportedly saying that he would not allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy. He retired to his mother's estate in Chalcis on the island of Euboea. He died there the following year, in 322 before the Common Era, at the age of 62, possibly from a stomach ailment. The scope and depth of Aristotle's work is astonishing. He wrote on virtually every subject known in his time. His works were preserved and transmitted through the centuries, translated into Latin, Arabic, and other languages. They became the foundation of medieval university education. In the Christian West, Aristotle was known simply as the philosopher. So dominant was his influence. His logic, his scientific method, his ethics, his political theory, all shaped the development of Western thought. But Aristotle's legacy is complex. His scientific theories, while impressive for his time, were eventually superseded. His belief that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones was refuted by experiment. His geocentric model of the universe, with the Earth at the center and the celestial spheres revolving around it, was replaced by the heliocentric model. His reliance on observation without controlled experiment limited his scientific method, and his defense of slavery and his views on the natural inferiority of women are morally indefensible from a modern perspective. Yet his fundamental approach, the careful observation of nature, the classification of phenomena, the search for causes, the use of logic to organize knowledge, all of these remain relevant. His questions about ethics, about what makes a good life, about how we should organize our communities, about the nature of friendship and virtue are still our questions. And his willingness to disagree with his teacher Plato, to follow his own path of inquiry, reminds us that philosophy proceeds through questioning, through each generation, examining the ideas it inherits and building something new. The divergence and dialogue between Plato and Aristotle The relationship between Plato and Aristotle is one of the most productive and important in the history of ideas. For 20 years they worked together at the academy, teacher and student, collaborator and colleague, yet their philosophical visions diverged in fundamental ways. Understanding where they agreed and where they disagreed illuminates the central tensions in Western philosophy, tensions between reason and observation, between the ideal and the actual, between the universal and the particular. Both Plato and Aristotle sought to understand reality, to discover what truly exists beyond the shifting appearances of everyday experience. Both believed that such understanding was possible through reason. Both believed that living well required knowledge, that ethics and politics should be grounded in an understanding of human nature and the good. Both honored Socrates and carried forward his mission of philosophical inquiry. Yet the paths they took toward these shared goals led in different directions. At the heart of their disagreement is the question of universals. When we say that Socrates is a man, that Plato is a man, that Aristotle is a man, we are using the word man to refer to something common to all three. What is this common element? Does it exist independently of individual men, or does it exist only in them? Plato's answer is the theory of forms. The form of man exists separately, eternally, perfectly. Individual men are imperfect copies or reflections of this form. They participate in it or imitate it, and this participation is what makes them men. The form is more real than any individual man. It is unchanging while individual men are born, grow old, and die. Knowledge is therefore knowledge of the forms, not of individual things. Aristotle rejected this view. In his early work, On Ideas, now lost but referenced by later writers, he systematically criticized the theory of forms. If the forms are separate from individual things, he argued, they cannot explain those things. How does the form of man, existing in some transcendent realm, cause there to be actual men in the world? How do individual things participate in the forms? Plato's metaphor of participation is just that, a metaphor, not an explanation. Moreover, if we posit a form of man to explain what individual men have in common, do we then need a third man to explain what the form of man and individual men have in common? This leads to an infinite regress. For Aristotle, the universal exists, but it exists in the particular things themselves. The form of man is embodied in each individual man. It is not separate. To understand what a man is, we study actual men, observe their characteristics, abstract what they have in common. The form is the essence, the defining characteristics that make a thing what it is. But this essence does not exist independently. Destroy all men, and the form of man would cease to exist. Though, while men exist, the form is real and can be known by the intellect. This disagreement has profound implications. For Plato, true knowledge is of the eternal forms, accessible to pure reason. The philosopher turns away from the physical world to contemplate eternal truths. Mathematics is the model science because it deals with abstract, perfect objects. The physical world is a realm of shadows and illusions, not worthy of serious study for its own sake. For Aristotle, the physical world is worth studying. Nature is full of order and purpose. By observing, classifying, and understanding natural phenomena, we can gain genuine knowledge. Biology, physics, political science, all are legitimate fields of inquiry. Observation and empirical investigation are essential, not distractions from philosophical truth. This difference extends to their views on change. For Plato, the forms are unchanging. Change is characteristic of the imperfect physical world. The more something changes, the less real it is. For Aristotle, change is fundamental to reality. Understanding change, explaining how things come to be and pass away, is a central philosophical task. His concepts of potentiality and actuality, of the four causes, are tools for understanding change. In ethics, both philosophers agree that virtue is necessary for the good life and that reason should guide action, but they differ in emphasis and approach. Plato's ethics is more unified and idealistic. The form of the good is the ultimate source of all value. Virtue is knowledge of the good. If you truly understand what is good, you will do it. The philosopher king, having ascended to a vision of the form of the good, will rule justly because his knowledge compels him to do so. Aristotle's ethics is more pluralistic and practical. There is no single form of the good. Different things have different goods, appropriate to their nature. The good for a human being is eudaimonia, flourishing, which involves a complete life of virtuous activity. Virtue is not simply knowledge, but a disposition, a habit of choosing the mean between extremes. Practical wisdom, not theoretical knowledge, guides moral action, and Aristotle acknowledges that external goods like health, wealth, and friendship contribute to happiness. You cannot be fully happy if you are sick, impoverished, and friendless, no matter how virtuous you are. This is more realistic, perhaps, than Plato's claim that the wise person is happy even under torture. In politics, Plato's Republic presents a utopian vision of a city ruled by philosopher kings, organized according to reason, with each class performing its proper function. Private property and family are abolished for the guardian class. Education is carefully controlled. The goal is unity and justice, understood as each part doing what it is naturally suited to do. Aristotle's politics is more empirical and pragmatic. He examines actual constitutions, cataloguing their strengths and weaknesses. He recognizes that different constitutions suit different cities. He prefers a mixed constitution with a strong middle class. He does not believe that abolishing private property or family is desirable. He thinks these institutions, properly regulated, contribute to the good life. His political philosophy is informed by observation of what actually works, not by a vision of an ideal city designed according to abstract principles. In their views on art and poetry, the differences are also instructive. Plato is suspicious of art. In Book 10 of the Republic, he argues that the arts are twice removed from reality. A painter who paints a bed is imitating a physical bed, which is itself an imitation of the form of bed. Art deals in illusions, appealing to the emotions rather than reason. Poetry can corrupt the soul by presenting the gods and heroes behaving badly, by arousing pity and fear, by gratifying the irrational parts of the soul. For these reasons, Plato would exclude most poetry from his ideal city, keeping only hymns to the gods and praises of good men. Aristotle defends poetry in his Poetics. Imitation is natural to humans. We learn through imitation, and we take pleasure in it. Tragic poetry, far from corrupting the soul, produces catharsis, a purging or purification of the emotions. By experiencing pity and fear in the safe context of the theatre, we are somehow educated and improved. Art can reveal universal truths about human nature. The poet is concerned not with what has happened, but with what might happen, with the universal rather than the particular. In this sense, poetry is more philosophical than history. Despite their disagreements, there is a deep respect between Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle begins his metaphysics by praising Plato. and the Pythagoreans for their contributions to philosophy. He acknowledges that his own inquiries build on their work. When he criticizes Plato, it is in the spirit of seeking truth, not of tearing down his teacher. There is a medieval saying, "Amicus Plato sed magis amica veritas." I love Plato, but I love truth more. Whether Aristotle actually said this is uncertain, but it captures the spirit of his relationship with Plato. Plato's influence on Aristotle is evident throughout Aristotle's work. Aristotle's careful definitions, his systematic approach, his concern with ethics and politics, his belief that philosophy should address the most important questions about human life, all reflect his training in the academy. Even his criticisms of Plato show how deeply he engaged with Platonic ideas. And Plato, though he died before Aristotle wrote most of his major works, would surely have recognized the brilliance and originality of his student. In the later dialogues, Plato himself raises objections to the theory of forms, suggesting that he was aware of its difficulties. Perhaps he would have appreciated Aristotle's attempt to preserve the insights of the theory, while grounding forms in the natural world. The dialogue between Plato and Aristotle continues through the centuries. Later philosophers take sides or attempt syntheses. The Neoplatonists, such as Plotinus in the 3rd century of the Common Era, develop elaborate versions of Plato's philosophy. Medieval Christian philosophers like Augustine are deeply Platonic in orientation, emphasizing the transcendence of God and the superiority of the soul over the body. Later medieval thinkers like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century integrate Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, using Aristotle's concepts of form and matter, potentiality and actuality, to explain doctrines like the Eucharist and the nature of the soul. In the Renaissance, humanist scholars debate the relative merits of Plato and Aristotle. Some favor Plato's elegance and idealism. Others prefer Aristotle's systematic rigor and empirical approach. The scientific revolution of the 17th century eventually overthrows Aristotelian physics, but retains something of his empirical spirit. Thinkers like Francis Bacon call for a new method based on observation and experiment, criticizing Aristotle for relying too much on deductive reasoning from general principles. The modern period sees continued engagement with both philosophers. Rationalist philosophers like Descartes and Spinoza, who emphasize reason and innate ideas, are in some ways Platonic. Empiricist philosophers like Locke and Hume, who emphasize sensory experience, are in some ways Aristotelian. Kant attempts a synthesis, arguing that knowledge requires both sensory input and rational categories. Hegel develops a dialectical method that sees contradictions as driving the development of ideas, a method that owes something to both Plato's dialectic and Aristotle's logic. In the 20th century, the dialogue continues. Process philosophers like Whitehead draw on both Plato and Aristotle. Analytic philosophers debate the nature of universals, whether they are real entities or merely names. Virtue ethicists revive Aristotelian ethics, emphasizing character and practical wisdom rather than rules and consequences. Political philosophers continue to argue about the relationship between the individual and the community, between freedom and order, between the ideal and the possible. What makes this dialogue so enduring? Perhaps it is because Plato and Aristotle represent two fundamental orientations of the human mind. Plato represents the aspiration toward the eternal, the perfect, the transcendent. He reminds us that there is more to reality than what we can touch and see, that reason can lead us beyond the apparent to the real. Aristotle represents the patient investigation of the world around us, the careful observation, the systematic classification, the respect for the particular and the concrete. He reminds us that truth is found not only in abstract principles, but in the rich variety of natural phenomena. We need both. A purely Platonic philosophy risks becoming detached from reality, lost in abstractions, constructing beautiful systems that have no connection to actual experience. A purely Aristotelian philosophy risks becoming mired in details, collecting facts without understanding the deeper principles that unify them. The history of philosophy, of science, of human thought generally, is in large part the story of trying to balance these two impulses, to be both visionary and empirical, both systematic and responsive to particulars. And so the conversation between Plato and Aristotle goes on. Their questions remain our questions. Their arguments inform our arguments. In every generation, some thinkers are drawn more to Plato, others more to Aristotle, and the wisest try to learn from both. The dialogue is not finished. It cannot be finished, for the questions they raised about the nature of reality, about knowledge, about the good life, about justice and beauty and truth, are questions that each age must answer for itself, drawing on the wisdom of the past, but thinking for ourselves. Just as Socrates taught, just as Plato exemplified, just as Aristotle demonstrated. The enduring legacy and contemporary relevance. As we near the end of our long, quiet contemplation of these three great philosophers, it is worth pausing to consider what they have meant to the centuries that followed them, and what they might still mean to us today. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle lived more than 2,300 years ago, in a world vastly different from our own. They lived in small city-states, not global civilizations. They had no knowledge of modern science, no technology beyond simple tools and machines. They accepted institutions like slavery that we rightly condemn, yet their ideas continue to resonate, to challenge, to inspire. The transmission of their thought through history is itself a remarkable story. After Aristotle's death in 322 before the Common Era, his works were not widely known for several centuries. His personal library, containing his treatises, was hidden away and suffered damage. It was not until the 1st century before the Common Era that a complete edition was produced in Rome. Meanwhile, Plato's dialogues were preserved and read continuously. The academy he founded continued for centuries, though it changed in character over time. In the Hellenistic period, following the conquests of Alexander the Great, Greek culture spread throughout the Mediterranean world and into Asia. Philosophy flourished, but the dominant schools were no longer Platonism and Aristotelianism, but rather Stoicism, Epicureanism, and skepticism. These schools were concerned primarily with ethics, with how to achieve tranquility and happiness in a turbulent world. They drew on Socratic and Platonic ideas, but developed them in new directions. Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium around 300 before the Common Era, taught that virtue is sufficient for happiness, that we should accept whatever happens with equanimity, and that we are all part of a rational, cosmic order. This reflects Socratic emphasis on virtue and self-control. Epicureanism, founded by Epicurus around the same time, taught that pleasure, understood as the absence of pain and disturbance, is the highest good. This seems opposed to Socratic ethics, but Epicurus insisted that true pleasure requires virtue and wisdom. Skepticism, developed by Pyrrho and others, questioned whether we can have certain knowledge about anything, echoing Socrates' profession of ignorance. In the early centuries of the Common Era, a movement called Neoplatonism revived and elaborated Plato's philosophy. The most important Neoplatonist was Plotinus, who lived from approximately 204 to 270. Plotinus taught that all reality emanates from a single, transcendent source he called the One. From the One flows intellect, which contains the Platonic forms. From intellect flows soul, which animates the physical world. Human beings have souls that can ascend through contemplation, back toward union with the One. This mystical interpretation of Plato influenced early Christian theology and later Islamic and Jewish philosophy. Christianity, emerging in the 1st century, gradually absorbed Greek philosophy. Early Christian apologists argued that Greek philosophy, particularly Platonism, prepared the way for Christian revelation. The Gospel of John identifies Jesus Christ with the Logos, the rational principle that Greek philosophers had spoken of. Augustine of Hippo, living from 354 to 430, fused Neoplatonism with Christian doctrine. The soul's ascent to God, the superiority of the eternal over the temporal, the role of illumination in knowledge, all reflect Platonic themes adapted to Christian ends. In the Islamic world, which preserved and translated Greek texts during the European Middle Ages, both Plato and Aristotle were studied intensively. Philosophers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes wrote commentaries on Aristotle, attempting to reconcile his philosophy with Islamic theology. Averroes in particular defended Aristotle's thought and transmitted it back to Western Europe through his extensive commentaries. In medieval Europe, from about the 12th century onward, Aristotle's works were translated from Arabic and Greek into Latin. The result was a philosophical revolution. The new universities of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna made Aristotle the basis of education. Students studied his logic, his natural philosophy, his metaphysics, his ethics. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century produced a grand synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. He argued that reason and faith are compatible, that philosophy and theology address the same reality from different perspectives. Aquinas used Aristotelian concepts to explain Christian doctrines, arguing, for instance, that God is pure actuality, with no potentiality, and that the soul is the form of the body. This Aristotelian dominance lasted for centuries, but it was eventually challenged. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries overturned Aristotelian physics. Galileo showed through observation and experiment that all objects fall at the same rate regardless of weight. Copernicus and Kepler demonstrated that the Earth revolves around the Sun, not vice versa. Newton provided a mathematical account of motion and gravity that replaced Aristotelian explanations. Francis Bacon criticized the Aristotelian method of deducing conclusions from general principles and called for a new method based on inductive reasoning from observations. Yet even as Aristotelian science was replaced, Aristotelian logic remained central. Aristotle's syllogistic logic was taught in universities until the development of modern symbolic logic in the 19th and 20th centuries. And Aristotle's approach to ethics and politics continued to influence thinkers. His virtue ethics, his emphasis on human flourishing, his attention to the mean between extremes, all remained relevant. Plato experienced something of a revival in the Renaissance, as humanist scholars rediscovered his dialogues. The beauty of his writing, the power of his ideas, the spiritual depth of his philosophy appealed to Renaissance thinkers. The Platonic Academy in Florence, led by Marsilio Ficino in the 15th century, translated and promoted Plato's works. Platonic love, the idea of a love that transcends the physical and aims at the beautiful and the good, became an important theme in Renaissance literature. In the Enlightenment of the 18th century, philosophers were more likely to criticize than to praise the ancient Greeks. Voltaire dismissed much of ancient philosophy as speculation unsupported by evidence. Rousseau questioned whether the intellectual achievements of civilization represented moral progress. But Kant, perhaps the greatest philosopher of the Enlightenment, engaged deeply with both Plato and Aristotle. His epistemology, his account of how we know, attempts to combine rationalist and empiricist insights. His ethics, with its emphasis on duty and the categorical imperative, differs from ancient virtue ethics, but addresses similar questions about right action. In the 19th century, there was renewed interest in ancient philosophy. Hegel saw the history of philosophy as a dialectical process, with each philosopher responding to contradictions in earlier thought. He placed Plato and Aristotle at the center of this development. Nietzsche admired the pre-Socratics and criticized Socrates for emphasizing reason over instinct, for introducing slave morality into Greek culture. This was unfair to Socrates, but it shows how ancient philosophy remained a living presence, something to argue with and about. The 20th century saw a revival of virtue ethics, largely inspired by Aristotle. Philosophers like Philippa Foot, Rosalind Hursthouse, and Alistair MacIntyre argued that modern ethics, focused on rules and consequences, had lost sight of character and virtue. They turned back to Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, finding in it resources for addressing contemporary moral questions. What virtues should we cultivate? What does it mean to flourish as a human being? How do we develop practical wisdom? These Aristotelian questions seemed more fruitful than debates about utilitarian calculations or deontological duties. In political philosophy, both Plato and Aristotle remain reference points. Leo Strauss and his followers read the ancient texts closely, arguing that they contain timeless wisdom about politics and the human condition. Karl Popper, on the other hand, criticized Plato's Republic as a blueprint for totalitarianism, arguing that the closed society it describes is inimical to the open society of liberal democracy. Debates about justice, about the relationship between the individual and the community, about the role of the state, continue to draw on ancient sources. In metaphysics and epistemology, the debates between Platonists and Aristotelians about universals continue in new forms. Are mathematical objects real, existing independently of the physical world and the human mind, as Platonists claim? Or are they mental constructs or linguistic conventions, as nominalists argue? Do abstract entities like numbers, sets, and properties exist, or are only concrete particular things real? These are not merely academic debates. They have implications for the philosophy of mathematics, the philosophy of science, and the philosophy of language. Even Socrates, who wrote nothing and whose actual views remain elusive, continues to be an inspiration. His method of questioning, his commitment to following the argument wherever it leads, his willingness to admit ignorance, his courage in facing death rather than compromising his principles, all serve as models for philosophical inquiry and for living an examined life. The Socratic method is used in law schools and classrooms to teach critical thinking. The image of Socrates as a gadfly, stinging the lazy horse of Athens into action, inspires activists and reformers who challenge complacency and question authority. But we should not romanticize these ancient philosophers or ignore their limitations. They were men of their time, and some of their views are deeply problematic. Plato's Republic proposes a rigid class system with no social mobility, communal living that abolishes family bonds for the guardian class, and censorship of art and poetry. Aristotle defended slavery as natural, claiming that some people are naturally suited to be enslaved and benefit from it. He believed women were naturally inferior to men, less rational, and suited only for domestic roles. These are not minor flaws or matters of interpretation. They are central to the political philosophies of both men, and they reflect the prejudices of ancient Greek society. We must read these philosophers critically, taking what is valuable while rejecting what is not. We must recognize that philosophy progresses, that we know things they did not, that our moral understanding has in some respects advanced beyond theirs. The fact that Aristotle was a brilliant biologist does not mean we should accept his physics. The fact that Plato was a profound metaphysician does not mean we should accept his politics. We can learn from them without treating them as infallible authorities. What then can we take from Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle? Perhaps most fundamentally, we can take their conviction that the examined life is worth living, that philosophy matters, that asking deep questions about reality, knowledge, and value is a worthwhile human activity. In a world that often prioritizes practical results and material success, they remind us that understanding and wisdom are goods in themselves. From Socrates, we can take the importance of questioning assumptions, of recognizing the limits of our knowledge, of pursuing truth through dialogue. We can admire his integrity, his willingness to stand by his convictions, even unto death. We can practice the Socratic method, asking not just what people believe, but why they believe it, probing for inconsistencies, seeking clarity. From Plato, we can take the insight that there is more to reality than the physical world, that reason can access truths that transcend sensory experience. We need not accept the theory of forms in its literal sense to appreciate the idea that mathematics, logic, ethics, all point to something beyond the merely material. We can value the life of the mind, the pursuit of truth and beauty and goodness, the attempt to apprehend the eternal in the midst of the temporal. From Aristotle, we can take the importance of careful observation, of systematic study, of seeking to understand the natural world in all its rich variety. We can adopt his virtue ethics, asking not just what rules we should follow, but what kind of people we should strive to become. We can appreciate his pluralism, his recognition that different things have different goods, that there is no single form of human flourishing. And from all three, we can take the model of the philosophical life as one of dialogue, of teacher and student, engaged in common inquiry, of each generation building on the achievements of the past, while striking out in new directions. Philosophy is not a set of doctrines to be memorized, but an activity, a practice, a way of engaging with fundamental questions. In our contemporary world, with its rapid technological change, its complex social problems, its environmental challenges, we need philosophical thinking more than ever. We need to ask questions about justice, about what we owe to each other, about how to live well in diverse and interconnected societies. We need to think carefully about the ethics of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, climate change. We need to cultivate practical wisdom, the ability to navigate morally complex situations without rigid rules. The great Greek philosophers do not provide ready-made answers to our contemporary questions. They lived in a different world, but they provide tools for thinking, frameworks for inquiry, inspiration for the philosophical life. They remind us that human beings have always wondered about these things, that we are part of a long conversation stretching back thousands of years and extending forward into an unknown future. As you drift now towards sleep, let the ideas of these ancient thinkers settle gently in your mind. Socrates in the Agora, questioning passers-by. Plato, in the academy, teaching students, writing his dialogues, Aristotle, at the Lyceum, observing nature, classifying, explaining, 3 men, long dead, but their thoughts still alive, still sparking new thoughts in each generation. Perhaps you will dream of Athens, its white marble glowing in the sunlight, the blue Aegean beyond. Perhaps you will walk through the Academy's groves, listening to philosophical discussions. Perhaps you will wander the Lyceum's grounds, examining plants and animals with Aristotle. Or perhaps you will simply rest, your mind quiet, having spent these hours in the company of great thinkers, considering questions that have no final answers, but are worth asking nonetheless. The unexamined life, Socrates said, is not worth living. But the examined life, we might add, also needs rest. The questions will still be there tomorrow. For now, there is only the slow drift into sleep, the mind releasing its grasp on thoughts, letting them float away like leaves on a stream. The great philosophers would understand. Even Aristotle, for all his intellectual energy, knew that contemplation requires leisure, and leisure includes rest. Even Plato, for all his emphasis on the eternal forms, lived in a body that needed sleep. Even Socrates, on the day of his death, lay down when his legs grew heavy. And so we leave them here, these 3 wise men of ancient Greece, still talking perhaps in some realm beyond time, still arguing, still questioning, still seeking truth. Their voices grow fainter now, fading into the distance, into history, into the quiet that comes before sleep. The questions remain, as they always have, as they always will, patient and eternal, waiting for the next mind to take them up and consider them anew. But not tonight. Tonight, there is only stillness, only rest, only the slow and gentle descent into sleep, where even philosophers go, and from which perhaps we will wake with minds refreshed, ready to examine life once more. For now, it is time to rest.